and some of the tools that are used in different contexts. And we'll take an example as well from one of the countries in the region. And then we're going to get into the final section, which is stakeholder coordination, which is going to look at how do we bring all the actors together. And then finally, we'll thread everything together and set up for the next phase, which is the mainstreaming sessions, which we hope you will be interested to join. Just a brief about REDS. The Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat, if you're engaging with us for the very first time, we are a secretariat comprised of 14 NGOs, primarily humanitarian agencies. Most of them are international NGOs, and we have one national one, which is RCK, Refugee Consortium of Kenya. And we were created to ensure that we maintain focused momentum around engagement of stakeholders around durable solutions within the region. And every time we talk about the region, we are talking about the East and Horn of Africa region, as well as the Great Lakes region. And how we work is that we primarily advocate for the inclusion of displacement affected communities in everything that we do. And we work with our members closely to ensure that they're integrated into solutions for themselves. And as you will see later on, the slogan, nothing about us without us, is very, very close to the ethos of what RED stands for. Then we endeavor to, and it's a work in progress, we endeavor to ensure that we work with everyone within the field, that is various implementers, which also covers NGOs at all levels. And we work with national and subnational governments, as well as other policymakers, including donors and their governments, the governments that they represent, as well as international financial institutions. And we work also with a wide extent of an array of research partners. All this is to ensure that, one, we are able to influence policy decisions with evidence. We are also able to link that evidence, which will inform practice. And finally, to ensure that we can inform, influence, and enable collaboration of all the actors to restore dignity to displacement-affected communities. With that, having said that, we are going to delve into the crux of it. I'd like to invite, okay, I see a hand raised by Barnabas, but I'd encourage you, Barnabas, that we first take the first section, unless it's something that you'd like to clarify in terms of seeing the screen. Right. I think you're going to allow us to get into the next section, and then you can ask your question at the end of the next session. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Freddie to take the next section. Over to you, Freddie.
Thank you very much indeed, Francis. I hope everyone can hear me clearly and see me as well. My name is Freddie Carver, and I'm the head of the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat. And we're really delighted to have so many people participating today in this important session. So thanks very much for joining. So I'm just going to kick off with a bit of a kind of opener about what do we mean by durable solutions in this region. I think one of the things that we can all relate to, and I see from all the introductions in the chat box, we have such a wide range of practitioners and policymakers from different kinds of organizations. So I know we've got such a rich amount of experience, and I think something we can probably all agree on is that we sometimes struggle with what this concept of durable solutions really means. I'm not going to promise that we're going to provide you with easy answers. If there are easy answers, then I think we'd be in a different place. But I want to start by just opening up a little bit of the discussion and help us to think about what this might mean before we get into some of the detail later on with the rest of the team. So just to start off a little bit on the regional context, and I think it is really important, and this region in particular, I think, plays a really important part in the history of forced displacement in the world over the last 50, 60 years. It's really been kind of one of the parts of the world where there have been the largest number of people in forced displacement in various kind of forms, and that has a big bearing on what we mean by durable solutions. So I think we all know that the displacement in this region has been consistently high and protracted. We'll look at some of the numbers in a moment. And there's a wide range of factors driving that displacement. I think the most critical ones are around conflict and violence, around governance, and particularly in the kind of recent years, and we all are aware of the climate crisis, the cyclical climatic shocks, which are these kind of regular triggers to new displacements. As well as a whole range of other factors there, including food security, environmental degradation, poverty and economic challenges. And I think perhaps the kind of crucial thing I want to emphasize right at the start is we need to accept the complexity of displacement, and we need to understand that it can't be explained in simple terms by simple notions of push and pull factors. Populations in this region are dealing with multiple pressures on them, and also, and I think this is really key, displacements layering on top of each other. I think we all are aware that there are many countries in this region that have been suffering different kinds of displacement or experiencing different kinds of displacement for more than 50, 60 years. And that has a really significant impact on how people understand the notion of displacement, on how people understand what the kind of humanitarian response to displacement looks like, how they make decisions, and how they think about displacement in the context of their lives and their families and their kin's lives and the relationships and networks that have resulted from it. It is a system, and it's really complex, and we need to remember that as we think about the response to it. Protracted displacement is particularly prevalent in this region. UNHCR, I think, define protracted displacement as more than 5 years of displacement, and estimate that it represents more than 60% of the current displacement in the region, particularly from countries like Somalia, South Sudan, Burundi, that have been responsible for refugee flows in particular for many, many years, and people living in different parts of the region in very difficult conditions. And this protracted displacement is particularly where we then think about, well, how can we promote more durable solutions rather than people being trapped in situations of extreme precarity, extreme poverty, often in very difficult circumstances. But on top of that, as I say, we have these new waves of displacement. Just in the last couple of years, we've seen a whole range of different displacements, whether it's relating to the climate shocks, the droughts, the flooding, or the kind of really significant conflicts that have re-emerged over the last few years. And we have a really challenging situation at the moment. And I think, again, everyone in this call will be well aware of the context in terms of the overall pressure on the aid system, particularly at a time when the aid system is also dealing with the response to Ukraine. Right now, the situation in Gaza as well. So there's a huge amount of pressure on the system as a whole. We also need to remember that displacement is both internal and external. Traditionally, refugee situations have received a lot of international attention, but I think we know that the internal displacement picture is even more challenging in terms of pure numbers. It's estimated around double the numbers of people that have been displaced across borders. And again, these are waves of different displacements. Some people who've been in IDP contexts for, again, decades in some cases, others who are moving much more kind of recently. The IDP response is in some ways much more complicated for the international system. It raises challenging questions around the sovereignty of states and their responsibilities to their own people, but these populations often sit on a very long-term basis within humanitarian programming and as part of humanitarian caseloads in the countries. And there is quite a bit of international focus at the policy level on internal displacement, particularly as a response to the UN high-level panel report a couple of years ago and the work that's going on around the UN Action Agenda, including in this region. And finally, I think the kind of point just to make in terms of context is this issue of urban displacement, which is a growing trend and has been for some years. And that's true both for refugees and IDPs. And in a context like Somalia in particular, the notion of displacement is tied up in also kind of processes of urbanization and the way that the conflict and also the drought and flooding conditions are shaping the future of Somalia as well. So there's a lot going on in as we try to understand displacement more fully and also think about what responses to displacement could look like. So just to have a quick look at the numbers, the next slide just gives an overview across the region. I'm still seeing the previous slide. There we go. So this is just a quick overview. I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but for anyone who isn't kind of aware of the overall picture, it just gives a flavor of where the largest number of IDPs are, the largest number of refugees. We've also included in this both refugees that are hosted in particular countries, but also for those countries who have produced the largest number of refugees, those figures are also there, just to give you a sense of those countries that have produced the largest numbers. South Sudan is particularly high, as is Sudan, Somalia, from that context. But yeah, so that just gives you an overall picture across the region. So going to the next slide, we really want to get into this question of what are durable solutions. And I just want to kind of offer a few different answers to that question, as I say, to get you thinking. We're going to get a bit more into the detail of the different normative frameworks in the next session. But I think the most kind of traditional answer to the question of what are durable solutions comes from where the notion really began, which is out of international refugee law and kind of UNHCR's notion of there being 3 durable solutions, which I think is the kind of, as I said, the original definition of durable solutions. So voluntary repatriation, i.e. the return of people that have been displaced, of refugees, to their countries of origin at a time when it's safe for them to do so, or resettlement to a third country. And I think we're all aware of some of the kind of trends around resettlement flows from this region over the last 30, 40 years and the kind of significant reduction in resettlement places that we've seen. Or finally, local integration, i.e. people kind of staying in their places of displacement, but out of being kind of restricted in terms of their rights in their refugee context. And traditionally, that idea of local integration has been very challenging to achieve. Refugee hosting countries have often been resistant to the idea of large-scale providing citizenship rights to refugees, and wanted to avoid that for domestic political reasons, and thereby making it very challenging in these situations of chronic conflict and when resettlement opportunities are very low. I think there are traditionally three key principles have been seen to underpin these solutions around voluntariness. Fundamentally, displaced people should have the right to choose for themselves. Safety and dignity. These are really critical principles to avoid the forcible return or relocation of people in vulnerable situations to places where they do not want to be. And at the heart of all of this, and I think this is a really important point to remember, is the idea of being able to re-establish the relationship between rights holders, those people who've been displaced, who have had their relationship with their state that is responsible for meeting those rights broken, and re-establishing a relationship between those rights holders and duty bearers, whether that's back in their countries of origin or elsewhere. That's at the kind of heart of the idea of durable solutions, and I think that's really important to remember. But these have proved really challenging to deliver for the reasons I've already said. And so we've seen a kind of whole set of emerging discussions over decades. And I think it's really important to remember that these challenges have been around for a long time, and we go through these policy cycles in terms of trying to find answers. And this goes right back to the 70s. And we've seen waves of different approaches, particularly to refugee management. And these discussions that still come up regularly around the kind of balance of responsibility between those countries that host refugees and those that fund refugee hosting programs, what's often called in the international sphere burden sharing. These are still very much kind of perennial topics that underpin processes around the Global Refugee Compact and so on. But we've seen language around local solutions or complementary pathways, ideas that try to expand the range of durable solutions beyond these 3 core traditional solutions that have almost kind of legal status. On the right-hand side of this slide, then you see kind of what's come out of the discussion around internal displacement, and particularly the work done by the Interagency Standing Committee, the IASC, which has really kind of developed the most established framework for thinking about internal displacement and solutions to internal displacement. And there it's challenging because individuals are still within their country. They're still sort of formally within the responsibility of their duty bearers. So it's much more complicated to think about solutions in that context. And the notion that has been hit upon traditionally, and particularly by the IASC, is around this notion of relative need and relative rights. And I'll read this out. A durable solution is achieved when IDPs no longer have any specific assistance and protection needs linked to their displacement and enjoy their human rights without discrimination on account of their displacement. So this notion that displacement causes particular challenges or vulnerabilities, and that those particular challenges should be ended for someone to be considered no longer an IDP, with the same principles of voluntariness, safety, and dignity still being fundamental. And we'll talk a little bit more later about the kind of the way that the IASC framework seeks to develop this and set out different dimensions of rights and needs that need to be responded to in order to meet this definition. But I think what we can see here is that this is a spectrum. This is about shades of grey, and it's hard to draw kind of definitive lines around what can be defined as internal displacement and not. And we see this across this region and other regions. This question of when does internal displacement end? What counts? How do we define that? Again, these are questions that we'll come back to. So I think just something that should be clear is that it is not easy to define neatly what a durable solution is for a displacement affected person. And I think the real challenge around durable solutions, particularly in this region, but not just this region, is that durable solutions in the ways that they are defined have proved extremely elusive. And so it becomes a real challenge to be discussing durable solutions with displacement affected communities who I think increasingly become somewhat cynical about what this agenda is really about and whether it's really responding to their needs. So I think at the bottom here, what we've tried to do is capture what we see as the kind of key elements of a durable solution approach. What are the questions we always should be asking ourselves if we want to be serious about promoting durable solutions, while recognizing that the provision of those solutions may not be within our power, particularly as external actors? And there's four kind of key principles that I think REDS is kind of focused on at the moment. The first is around being people-centered. And around really kind of making sure that there's a full recognition and understanding of the aspirations and capabilities of displacement affected people to be the kind of basis for thinking about solutions. Secondly, is around being politically informed. And we often talk about durable solutions needing to involve governments, and that should be clear from the emphasis on duty bearers. And government leadership is a key principle often in durable solutions programming, but that's also challenging. And we need to be realistic about the politics of displacement, the politics of marginalization in the countries in which we work, understanding what those look like in very kind of particular local circumstances, and understanding how we can work with political actors to support the promotion of solutions. So that political element is really key. Third is around coordination and efficiency of resource use. I think one of the critical aspects of solutions approaches is that they involve, we'll come back to this right at the end, they involve a very wide range of actors, of types of activity. We often in this sector talk about the triple nexus. I think if we really want to kind of get into it with durable solutions, we could probably come up with 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different nexus areas that need to be brought together. The private sector, the public sector, short-term, long-term, medium-term, aid actors, humanitarian actors, development actors. There's a lot that needs to be brought together. That's why we often talk about area-based approaches and the importance of really kind of finding ways to work together in a coordinated way. And also, and I think this is particularly important at the current moment, thinking about how to efficiently make use of all the resources that can be deployed to support solutions, whether those exist within the aid sector, within governments, budgets, within people's own networks, and or in the private sector. And I think there's a lot of thinking at the moment about how to try and bring these different aspects together. But this idea of collective action, I think, is fundamental to durable solutions. And we'll come back to the question of coordination later. And then finally, and this is, I think, an obvious point, but it is about thinking beyond the short term and about trying to stretch ourselves beyond humanitarian cycles. Even if we are kind of only acting with humanitarian funding or on very short-term basis, we can still think about the longer term and about the longer term aspects of what we're doing, because what we do does have longer term implications, even in the context of short-term projects. So that's really just to kind of get some thinking going about how we might understand what durable solutions are. But next, I think what we're going to do is hear from Mohammed Hassan. And Mohammed is somebody that worked with REDS on a placement last year for a few months and did some work for us on trying to kind of reflect on what durable solutions means from the perspective of displaced people. Mohammed is a refugee himself. I'll let him say a bit more himself about his background, but you can also see it on the screen in front of you. He's also a researcher working with the Refugee-Led Research Hub in Nairobi. So I think Mohammed was just going to say a few things about how he sees and understands this notion of solutions before we continue. Thanks, Mohammed. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Freddie. I hope my voice is coming through very clearly. My network is also a bit patchy, so please let me know, the admin team, if I cut out at any moment. But thank you for having me this session, Freddie. So my name is Mohammed Hassan. I'm now joining you from Nairobi, Kenya. I've spent most of my life as a refugee in Kakuma camp. So I have that encampment perspective. I'm privileged that I have been able to do more with my life. And now that I have the chance of being a researcher, looking at some of these experiences and looking at the different phenomena, my research centers on durable solution, refugee self-reliance, and refugee leadership. All these three elements are based on my own life, and I guess my research is also a part of discovery, if you can call it that. But coming back to this session, the durable solution aspect, I just want to begin from the beginning and say that I think durable solutions mean different things to different people, depending on where you are sitting at that table or the role that you play. So for people who see themselves, or the actors who see themselves as solution providers, who see themselves as the architects, they have their interpretation of what durable solution means, and I think that is somewhat different from the other side of that table, which is people who are living that life in how they view durable solutions. And I just want to clarify that for so long this discussion has been binary, just like the way I said it now. It was described as solution providers, the people who are here to help, and then on the other side you have the people to be helped. And I think going forward, that's not really the best kind of categorization or characterization that we want to have. It's not that distinct. And I think now increasingly what we are seeing is, people also assuming that role of helping, and COVID-19 has allowed a chance for that to be recognized. But just coming back to that table and saying the description and the definition of durable solution largely depends on where you are sitting. I think from my own research, the people that I've spoken to, fellow refugees, and my own understanding, durable solution is viewed as a destination to get to. And that destination is different from where you currently are. So many refugee people see themselves as being in transit. You're headed somewhere, even though you have been in the same place for 20 years or 30 years. So, and I think from the side of practitioners, what we are now seeing is durable solution is being defined as how can you have a better life where you are, and not necessarily going to a different place. And I think many refugees have, or other displaced people have not come to that realization yet. Durable solution was always something to get to, whether that's going abroad, whether that's going back home, whether that is going from the camp to a city, but it was always about moving forward physically, moving spaces. So mobility was a huge definition of that. But I guess increasingly now with the development approach and the area-based approach, we are now seeing that people are yet to come to terms with that. And I think for me, if someone were to ask me what makes an effective durable solution, what makes an effective intervention, I think any intervention has to have two key components. So one, because we're now talking about development, any durable solution has to be centered or anchored upon effective livelihood programming. That is the key component. And understanding that the durable solution does not happen in isolation, that it has these components. So one is livelihood programming, and also viewing livelihood programming, again, holistically in relation to durable solution. For example, viewing it in relation to education and also in relation to, I think, regulatory frameworks. One of the research that we did at the hub last year was looking at refugee access to work permits and business license. So, and one of the things that the feedback we got from refugees during the application process was the gap between policy and action. Through the policy, the gap between policy and practice. So even though policies might be, the government has policies that seem progressive, what is actually happening on the ground? And I think recently we saw that, for example, in the context of Kenya, we saw that government has gazetted 6 documents that refugees have as valid documents for government services. In accessing government services, there is a step in the right direction, but as researchers we want to follow up and we want to see what is the implementation, what does that actually look like in practice. And I think it's always good to be mindful of that distinction and looking at that gap, what is on paper and what are people's lives on the ground. So one is that livelihood programming. And I think that programming has to be, as I said, it has to be holistic, but then also it has to be in a way that is sustainable. How can people continue with this so that even livelihood does not become a forever agenda, which is, we keep supporting people financially, and then that just, it's a continuation of the aid cycle. And I think the second thing, and I would say this is actually more important, is looking at community-based accountability. Accountability for me is the biggest factor, in any intervention, especially in durable solutions. Who, as actors, as practitioners, who do we feel accountable to? And I think, speaking realistically, how do we balance, donor accountability with community-based accountability? How can we allow the people that we serve, how can they, give us their feedback on whether what we are doing is meaningful? So even I think in very restrictive environments, I think finding a way to incorporate community accountability is really key. And I think sometimes when you don't have that community voice, when you don't have that local voice, you can end up being in a bubble pursuing objectives and programs that may not in the long term really benefit anyone. I know I said 2, but if I can add one more component for me, that I think is a must for the durable solution agenda. It's working with refugee-led organizations. That is what we also saw during the time of COVID, and from our research in the Horn of Africa, in the East Africa region. We did a 1-year study looking at refugee-led organizations in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and also Tanzania. These 4 countries have different refugee policies. They have different refugee management systems. But in each country, we found refugee-led organizations. They may not have that title, they may not have that name, but basically we found community organizations that are trying to do that are trying to provide solutions at the local level. So again, talking about community ownership and sustainability, the agenda has to be driven by people on the ground, people whose day-to-day life revolves around these interventions. I think it can be easy sometimes, or you can have a different perspective when it's a job for you versus when this is your life and your family's life and your kids' life. I think there is an added importance. And I think trying to put on our thinking caps in looking at every location that we work with, to what extent are we actually involving communities, and not just, there is a ladder of participation, not just, getting a yes from them at the end, or even working with them as just implementers, but how can we tap into community resources, the community knowledge in identifying, key areas, in identifying problems, and then having them help us design, co-lead some of our own interventions. I know that this is difficult and change is frightening, even for refugees and displaced people. When you tell them that you have to be part of the solution, it's also frightening for some of these people who have been led to believe that they're here to be helped, that they are incapable of helping themselves. So it's frightening for communities, and it's a bit challenging also for practitioners. But I guess, change is inevitable. So how do we change the status quo when it comes to, whose priorities are being considered and who are we accountable to? I know this is, that's where I want to leave it at, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I'll be here if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer in the chat, but I want to commend all of you for the work that you are trying to do. It's not easy, and yeah, I know sometimes this can feel like an ungrateful job, like you're doing this task and nobody really understands, and you have people, I come in and I tell you, like, this is not the right way to do things, but you are changing lives, you are helping people on the ground, and I think that's really, it's the biggest thing that anyone can do. Trying to help traumatized communities get back on their feet, there is something fulfilling about that. That really transcends everything else. So continue being on the front lines, keep doing what you're doing, and please try to find a way to work with communities, community leaders, to get to better results. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, as ever. That was a really kind of, wonderful and concise intervention. And on a very personal level, I'm so happy to always hear you emphasize this question of accountability, because I think it is really absolutely fundamental. We've talked about it so much in the humanitarian sector, in the aid sector, but I think we still don't do a good enough job. We still see it as an extra, as a kind of something we should aspire towards. But I think you really made the point very powerfully that actually it should be fundamental to the work that we're trying to do. And only if we really get that work on accountability and downward accountability right, are we able to kind of really understand what these really complex processes look like in practice. So thanks so much for that. So I think really there is a just to kind of wrap up on this section, which as I said at the start was really just about trying to get some ideas out there and trying to help you locate both the kind of starting point of the discussion around solutions, but also trying to open it up and think about how do we apply it in practice. And I think this is a kind of interesting quote, just to kind of help us think about the realities of protracted displacement, which is so often what it is we are responding to. I think this quote really brings out the different dimensions of protracted displacement, of economic precarity, marginalization, rightlessness, future uncertainty. And I think that's something else that's coming out quite a lot in the work we've been doing recently, this issue of which we underestimate as a system in trauma. And if we're helping people think about the future, I think we know from kind of psychology and psychological studies that trauma makes it very challenging for anyone to think about their future and to feel like they have agency over their lives. That's what trauma is fundamentally about. And particularly in response to kind of immediate crises, trauma can be a hugely significant issue if someone is coming out of conflict or an extremely traumatic displacement experience. But actually the experience of being in protracted displacement is also fundamentally traumatic. And that's also another aspect. I think increasingly there's recognition that if we're serious about durable solutions, we need to think about that as well. So I think we'll pause there. I'll hand over to Irene to see if there are any initial kind of comments or questions on this first section before we move on to the next. Yeah, if you keep your camera on as well, Mohammed, in case there are any questions at this stage. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Freddie and Mohammed. I've been looking through the comments section, but we still haven't had any specific question per se. Perhaps then I would propose we open it up to the plenary for one or two participants to voice out their questions. I can only see Abraham, who has just posted something. I would read it verbatim. Very interesting points raised on coordination efforts, community engagement, ensuring government-led efforts to guarantee success of solutions. So this is more of reaction and commentary on on what you presented, Freddie. So no questions yet.
Okay, well, if there are none, then maybe we can move on to the next session. All right, thanks. Oh, we have one, I see.
Yes, Hilma, please feel free to unmute and ask a question. Please go ahead, Yilma, if you can hear me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. One point came to my mind, especially on the introduction part, the challenge that promoting durable solution is facing, the political commitment and the coordination part. As you know, there were, many, pledges and commitments at UN level and country level as well. Some countries have taken, some measurements, at least to accommodate and host those the assembly decisions and forums and other initiations. But when we see on the ground, the progress is still, in some countries you can't find even a single step forward. In some countries, there are some motivation. Even in some areas, in the refugee setting, if you take, the previous initiation and the commitment that we had, even nowadays, it became loosened or weakened. And you raised also the points of coordination and the networking. At international community level, those initiation, the GCR, the Global Compact on Refugee Forum, there were, initiations and commitments that also measure the progress of, the government commitment, the state commitment in different countries. But at some point also you can see, the close follow-up on that regard is not as such measurable and, delivered to those humanitarian agencies as well as, to the government agencies together. Some countries are faced, by increasing conflicts and displacement as well. And, the influx from here and there, you can see how the situation looks like in Africa, especially in the Horn of Africa. And the IGAD also trying, to address some issues and formulating policies. Those policies are there already. So my question is, what will be really the fits of our commitment at international and local level? So what shall we do, and what is really needed for us as humanitarian, organizations, working at national level in each country, working with the local community? What is really the special strategies that we need to follow to see how those commitments are really practiced and progressed accordingly? This has been a topic and a discussion agenda but you can see gaps here and there at the international and national level. So we are always here, the people in different countries and in different humanitarian organizations, and hearing challenges from year to year, year in, year out. So what do you suggest in this regard, really, to get, the commitments of the states and also the commitment from international community as well to push that these initiations are practically taking into practice, implementation, changing into implementation in all the settings that we have IDPs and the refugees. Thank you, over to you.
Thank you, Yilma. What a wonderful question, and not one that can be answered easily. And I think you put your finger on a number of the challenges and why this is an area that does feel extremely challenging at times. We're coming up to a Global Refugee Forum next month, and I think UNHCR has taken quite seriously some of the I think criticisms around the original GRF and the kind of development of pledges that was done by states, by non-state actors all over the world. But it was hard to really see what kind of a structure or framework there was for accountability around those pledges, whether they were the right pledges, whether they added up to. And I know there have been efforts around this GRF to really try and kind of develop that in a slightly more kind of strategic and structured way. But it's still challenging. And I'm sure we'll come away from the GRF in a month's time, still with big questions about what does all of this really mean, and how will it change things on the ground. And I think for me, if I have anything like an answer to your question, and I'm not sure I really do, it is about this idea of kind of thinking about the kind of vertical connections between the different layers. I think at the international level, this is very challenging. It's very easy for it to come to kind of a zero-sum game where countries that are hosting displaced people are looking for resources. The politics of international migration and displacement are extremely challenging, and I think we all know that, and we can't kind of forget that. And it does become a bit of a kind of battle for resources and control, and I think it's hard to find kind of really innovative solutions at that level. So I think it is about thinking locally and putting far more onus on the local level, recognizing that the local level can't operate on its own. So that's why I go back to this idea of kind of linking the very local with the national, with the international. But I think there is a need to kind of shift that center of gravity and say that ultimately the people who bear the brunt of displacement challenges are the displacement affected communities themselves and the places where they live. And if we can build local coalitions for solutions in this part of the world, and support local actors to develop those plans for solutions that are meaningful to them and that they feel they can implement, and help them attract the resources that they need to implement that. I think it's out of those kinds of areas of work that we can maybe demonstrate the art of the possible, and then put that back to the international level to say, actually, it isn't as hard as you think. And I think then the other issue is maybe around fragmentation as well. I think, and that's again a challenge in the context of an aid system that is really struggling for resources at the moment. That increases competition amongst different organizations, whether NGOs or UN agencies, and that issue of fragmentation can make really kind of collective approaches to solutions extremely hard to take forwards. So I think if we could work on those two things together, that might be a way forwards. I don't know, Mohammed, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think building local coalitions, I think you really touched the key points, and yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I will hand over to Patience now, I think.
Allow me to come in, Freddie. There's one more question from Solomon addressed to Mohammed. He says, interesting to hear what perspectives are of what durable solutions are differ depending on where you sit, for example, between the actors and beneficiaries. For Mohammed, would you then say the views are antagonistic? And if not, where do you see the convergence?
I mean, thank you so much for that question. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're antagonistic, but I just think that the aid system evolves rapidly, and sometimes as we develop these new frameworks and these definitions, we tend to leave people behind sometimes, and it's not really explained to people on the ground what that actually means. So for example, when people think of durable solution as a destination that they want to go to or a different location, that is not an innate idea that they were born with. It was part of the system for the last 30 years, 20 years. That is what people were fed. That is what people were told. I remember in the camp being told that you look at the board, the notice board, and if you see your ration card number, that means that you have an interview with UNHCR, a resettlement interview. So every week, every Friday, people would rush to the notice board and they would look for their ration card number, for example. So, you know, people have had that for 20 years. That, you know, you look at this board, look for your name, look for your, you know, ration card number, and then you do some things behind the scenes, and then you come back tomorrow and you say this is a development approach, and you know, we're trying to build the local capacity, and you've left so many people behind. And I think for so long the aid system has demonized the agency of people. People were encouraged to be docile, people were encouraged to be obedient, people were encouraged to wait for solutions. That relationship that we have built with communities was infantilizing, it was paternalistic, it was a really toxic kind of a relationship. And I think trying to move on without recognizing some of the damage that was done from that kind of approach is maybe short-sighted. So it's not antagonistic. People can still move forward. People can be on board with the new agenda, the socio-economic inclusion, the development. But I think we have to make it understandable and translate it to people in a way that it also makes it sense for them, that we just, like, you've always had your agency. We've tried to take that away from you, but you're the one who's in charge. You know, we're not trying to, like, we're not mini gods trying to determine people's destiny. Like, you're the one in charge, I think. So reaffirming for communities, it's a lot of work. It's not going to be easy, but I hope people can understand that somehow the aid system should be absolved of blame. And now everything's on the communities, that they don't understand, that they're not getting with the program. I think these are ideas that were created within these communities, and this is something we can change. We just have to be patient and try to understand how that can be done. And I think the best way is, again, using community structures, you know, trying to interact with the community, have these sessions with them, and just try to explain to them that what was tenable 10 years ago, it's not tenable because of A, B, C, and D. You know, people are adults. These are people, you know, who are sane people. So I think it's having dialogue, and oftentimes that dialogue has not always been there. I think the actors, the practitioners have created a bubble. They have tended to protect themselves from the people, and I think that relationship has to be addressed going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mohammed. That's I think such a useful intervention. I don't have anything to add from my side, Irene. So I think we can move on to the next section now. I just see a question coming in on our work in Somalia. Maybe I'll let later in the session we'll be hearing from one of the team that works primarily on Somalia. So maybe they can address that later. But over to you, Patience.
Thank you so much, Freddie, and I hope that my mic is clear enough. Please let me know in case not. I'll be taking you through durable solutions in practice, but really looking at the legal and normative frameworks around durable solutions, or what we can call the legal foundations of durable solutions, or of addressing displacement more generally. My name is Patience Kiara. I am the Red Kenya manager and also supporting the region. So for now, I just want to start off with defining what we mean, or what we are talking about when we say the legal and normative framework, and particularly because sometimes there has been a mix-up of terminology when we're talking about legal frameworks or policy frameworks or other normative frameworks. And just to define very quickly what we mean by that. So on the legal side of things, and if we're talking about the laws, then we are really talking about legally binding instruments or those laws that are very specific. They define relationships, they define the standards, the principles, and the agreements that have been set upon in terms of the duty bearers, but also in terms of the right holders. And they also determine what consequences there are for breaking the specific laws. Policies, on the other hand, are a bit different in the sense that they are not legally binding. So while they set out goals and the plan of action or guide action towards implementation of state obligation, they are not legally binding in and of themselves. So just that initial distinction, I think, is critical for us, even as we go ahead, because some of the normative frameworks that we'll be talking about are not necessarily laws, but are principles and guiding frameworks and policies that are really relevant for us to talk about. One other critical thing when we're talking about foundations for durable solutions is really looking at a human rights approach, because we are talking about protection of the rights of displaced people, but not only protection, but also upholding the civil, political rights, as well as the economic, social, and cultural rights for refugees, IDPs, returnees, and other displacement-affected communities. So with that, I can move to the next slide, Francis. So here we are quickly showing the legal frameworks, but also the policy frameworks. So to start off on the legal side and to start off with the refugees, most of you are already familiar with this and already know about the universal and the most comprehensive legally binding international instrument that defines the standard and the treatment for refugees, being the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. One of the most significant or critical safeguards of the 1951 Protocol is really the non-refoulement clause. And when I say this, I really mean the clause that speaks against return of refugees to areas where they would be persecuted or to areas where they would not receive protection and being part of the reason of their fleeing. So this non-refoulement clause has really been the most critical safeguard, and we have seen states being held accountable on returning refugees to areas where they would be persecuted based on this critical safeguard. However, we know that while this is very significant, it has not always been successful, and that it is still important for states to continue to hold themselves accountable and for the international community to hold states accountable on returning for refugees in areas where they still face persecution. And particularly in this region, we know that the conditions for return are still not suitable. And so this is, again, one of the critical factors for us to look at in the 1951 Convention. Even just more than the Convention, we know that there was the 1967 Protocol, and the reason why this protocol came into place is because following the 1951, there continued to be a lot of refugee situations that arose that were not necessarily captured within the 1951. And therefore, the 1967 opened up the space for more actors to get in and to actually assent to the 1951 Convention. But even closer in the region, around the 1960s, most African states started now the struggle to independence from colonial rule. And the Organization for African Union then passed the 1969 OAU Convention. The fundamental issues remain the same, but the major addition is really with the definition of who a refugee is, because at the time, of course, there was a lot of disruption to public order. And so it was felt that a more specific convention that addresses the specific needs of refugees within Africa was important. That 1969 OAU convention, as well as the 1951 convention, remain the anchoring instruments against which refugees are protected and assisted, but at the same time, they anchor durable solutions processes. We'll look a bit further on which specific aspects of those conventions talk about durable solutions. But just to say that also at the national level, most countries in East and Horn of Africa have domesticated the conventions. And we have national laws on refugees, and we have national policies on refugees. There's still quite a number of challenges and quite a long way to go in terms of actualizing the laws and the policies that we have in place. On the IDP side, the 2010 guiding principle, they're not a legally binding law, but they are very critical and have provided guidance and set out the principles and the standards for which IDPs are protected and assisted. We have seen that Africa has been on the lead with regards to the Kampala Convention, which was signed off by a number of African states in terms of addressing IDP issues in the various countries. In East Africa, there are few countries that have already not only ratified, but also, that have signed and ratified or domesticated the Kampala Convention. And this is very critical. And one of the key things why the guiding principles are important is because we have actually seen that most of the laws in East African countries have borrowed word for word the guiding principles. And again, the challenge has been, how do we implement these laws? Domesticating a law, domesticating an agreement, it is not enough, and we have to go beyond domestication and really look at the practical steps that should be taken, the structural architecture that should be in place in order to support the implementation of these laws. Most of the development-related rights that are key to sustainable reintegration are enshrined in these laws and policies, and we'll look at that a bit later. If you can take me to the next slide. So we started by saying that durable solutions are achieved by protecting the rights of displaced persons, and more specifically, we are really referring to the civil, political, social, and economic rights. When we talk about civil and political rights, we are talking about the rights that are related to, safety and physical well-being and family unity. But even beyond that, we're talking about personal documentation. We have seen, for instance, in the case such as Kenya, that while the laws are there, the law is there, the challenge really is very much anchored on documentation. And Mohammed mentioned in his previous session about documentation and why documentation is so key, personal documentation to access services, to access financial assistance and so forth. So in terms of other civil and political rights, we're really talking about the freedom of movement, the freedom of expression, opinion, religion, and so forth. And those things that really are core to the human nature that should be upheld in terms of ensuring that people are able to live in dignity and in safety. Then we are also talking about economic, social, and cultural rights. And here it's really about material rights, such as access to food, basic shelter, health, primary education. And a number of us here are already working on areas that support refugees and IDPs to access basic services, such as food, shelter, and so forth. Housing, land, and property is another critical area that hasn't been given as much focus as it deserves, particularly as an anchor to durable solutions or to accessing durable solutions as a kind of building block to accessing durable solutions. It's critical that refugees or IDPs and the situations here are very different in terms of national laws. But the bottom line is that people should be enabled to access land and to access property, because this really is at the core of finding solutions. Here, we're also talking about livelihoods and talking about education at a higher level. we like to say at RES that the quality of asylum determines the quality of solution. So really, when we're talking about these rights, we are looking at them as an enabling environment that allows refugees, IDPs to thrive within the areas in which they have sought asylum, and that this would then enable them and prepare them for solutions, whatever those solutions would be, whether it's a return back to places of origin, or whether that is integration within the areas of refuge, or further ahead in terms of resettlement in other areas, whether they be for IDPs or for refugees themselves. A number of challenges continue to exist, and one of those key challenges is this issue, and I think Mohammed mentioned it before, about policy moving faster than practice. We see that policy commitments at global level, at regional level, have significantly less implementation at the national level, and this has had huge implications. For instance, just looking at the case of IGAD, I mentioned before about some of the normative frameworks and the agreements that IGAD has assented to or agreed together with its member states, but we don't see the same level of commitment at the national level in terms of implementation. And that lagging behind of implementation has had a lot of impact in terms of what rights are actually on the table for refugees and IDPs. We also see national level limited political will to actualize some of the provisions. And we know that the securitization challenge for refugees particularly has really not gone away. And we continue to see refugees being hosted in very marginalized areas, and still a security lens being applied and more to specific sections of refugees than to others. But generally, we see that securitization is still a major challenge in terms of implementing the laws or actualizing the laws and the policies as they should. Something else that we continue to see is different apologies for that. Freddie, maybe could you confirm that I'm still
We can hear you
audible?
again now. You
We
cut
can
out
hear
for a
you.
moment, but you're back.
Okay. I was talking about the differences between national level implementation of laws and policy versus local level or county level or subnational level implementation of the same. In a context such as Kenya, we've seen that at the national level, conversations are a lot more difficult than at local level. And part of the reason is because at the county level or at the subnational level, this is where the benefits of refugee hosting are more likely to be felt by host communities in terms of, access to similar services, shared access to services, but also looking at the interconnectedness between refugees and host communities. So this difference in application of law is quite evident, but at the same time, I think there are gray areas that we can navigate to enable us to make progress at the local level. For instance, with Kenya, with the Kalobei Social Economic Development Plan, this is one of those plans that are not legally binding, but are a kind of policy that enables refugee actors, development humanitarian actors to come together around a common vision. And we have seen that this kind of an approach has been applied at a local level with a level of success. And we've seen that other areas within Kenya, such as Garissa now, are following the same footsteps. But at the same time, at the national level, we also see that now the country is trying to catch up with these incentives that are happening at the local level or at the county level. So I think this is something critical for us to reflect about as practitioners, both humanitarian and development, in terms of how to incentivize governments to work towards more favorable policy environment in terms of more access to rights for refugees and for IDPs. On the IDP side, because I think it's important to mention that there is less, what you would call less progress in terms of actualization of national laws that address the IDP situation. While there is, of course, quite a number of countries that have ratified the Kampala Convention, not the same number have really domesticated it. And the reason why domesticating a law such as a national IDP policy is because it is critical then to provide the mechanisms and the coordination structures that are relevant in terms of coordinating around IDPs. We know in a number of countries that an IDP Act has been put in place, but the structures that support the actualization or implementation of that are really missing. And so I think something else in terms of advocacy around IDP Acts and IDP regulations. So if you could go to the next slide. So here, we just wanted to take one step back and show you the anchorage of durable solutions within the conventions. And since we are saying that the conventions are really the anchor around all the issues around refugee protection and assistance. Article 34 of the UN Convention of 1951 talks about countries that are hosting refugees should offer the same level of the same standard or the same level of assistance as far as possible as other nationals to refugees. So it's about assimilating and naturalization of refugees, and there are a number of, so the convention allows states to determine the level of assimilation or the criteria for assimilation of refugees that are within its boundaries or within its borders. But the bottom line is that there should be an enabling environment or pathway that allows refugees to actually naturalize if they're allowed within those countries and if they meet the criteria that allows them to naturalize or to be registered as citizens of that country. Of course, there have been in this region, particularly countries within this region, quite a number of political challenges around naturalization. Even in countries as progressive as Uganda, we see that naturalization is really not on the table for refugees. And we know that this is kind of the last step in terms of integration, where refugees are able to have citizenship or to enjoy naturalization at par with other foreign nationals that have the same, can pass the same criteria. But for refugees, this is an area of advocacy because we have really not seen this. The 1952 refugees of Tanzania got naturalized, but we have seen that there has been quite a number of challenges in terms of actual integration, because at the end of the day, each of these solutions or settlement options is to lead to integration, and integration being really the ultimate end for addressing displacement challenges. The 1969 OAU Convention also talks about voluntary repatriation. And here the emphasis is on safety and dignity and the voluntary nature of repatriation. Again, in this region, we have seen states that have threatened, sometimes even gone ahead to return forcibly refugees within their borders. And we have seen also tripartite agreements that are not as voluntary in nature as is expected within the conventions or within the laws that are upholding refugees and also IDPs, really, to be honest. But in this case, speaking about refugees, and we have to look at what does voluntary mean, what does safety mean, what does dignity mean for refugees and for IDPs in terms of finding solutions, and really uphold that as at the core particularly of returns, because then we know that when returns are not voluntary, they're not sustainable. We have seen quite a number of thousands of refugees that were repatriated back to Somalia, coming back to Dadaab and going through difficult re-registration processes. And this is the kind of situation that we would want to really try and avoid by upholding voluntariness, safety, and dignity when we talk about returns. On the IDP side, the guiding principles on IDPs are also very instrumental and very critical when it comes to, well, whether it's a voluntary return or whether it's local integration. While it doesn't necessarily mention durable solutions, it does talk about voluntary repatriation and local integration, and provides the set standards and the set principles around which these settlement options can be actualized for IDPs. So if we come closer home, at least for me coming from Kenya, just to share a case study in terms of what we have seen in Kenya for the refugee law, in terms of inclusion, in terms of access to rights, in terms of social economic rights for refugees. We have seen that Kenya is really undergoing a significant policy shift at this time. In the last couple of years, Kenya has a new Refugee Act of 2021, and the focus has really been on inclusion of refugees to enable them to engage in the social economic development of the areas in which they are hosted. This is really in the spirit of inclusion within national systems, but also at the local authorities within the county integrated development plans. One of the critical elements of inclusion is really around the identification and civil registration documents. Documentation has been a major challenge for refugees in Kenya. And just recently, a couple of weeks ago, Mohammed mentioned this, the government has gazetted documentation for both refugees and asylum seekers that enable them to access national services and to access financial services. At this point, the government has made the refugee identity card in Kenya the same at par or at equal quality as the foreign identification document. This is quite a significant step in the right direction. But as Mohammed said, the critical thing is really how we implement this gazettement or how we implement this law. It will mean that quite a number of different departments within the government have to align to the new gazettement or have to align to the new law. It's about intergovernmental coordination between different ministries, a whole of government approach that enables the architecture for refugees to actually be included. Because what we have seen is that while the law is there, it's very clear a number of departments do not have either the same understanding or their systems have not been updated to the level where they can recognize refugee identity documents in terms of enabling refugees to access rights and to access services. So there's still quite a long way to go in terms of implementation of this act and in terms of implementation of the different documentation to allow refugees to access the different rights that are available to them. There's also the question of social economic rights. And particularly here, we are talking about the right to engage in profession and in trade. We have seen that in Kenya, the right to work has been there for a number of years, and actually refugees have access to what we call the Class M work permit that is actually free, is not costed, such as for other foreign nationals. But the challenge is really a practical one in terms of administrative barriers that hinder refugees from actually accessing these Class M work permits, and only a very small micro percentage of refugees have a work permit and are enabled to work within the borders in Kenya. Engaging in professional work is even more difficult with, questions around, the fact that jobs are available only to the national citizens, and there isn't enough to go around to enable refugees also to be part of it. So really, this also talks about the fact that displacement is a development challenge, because oftentimes the host communities are faced with the same situation or even worse situations than the refugees. And so we're talking about how do we then move on from the law and really look at more broadly how we can support social economic development for both refugees and host community, so that these hindrances that are sometimes there because of this discrepancy between refugees and host communities are removed in an effort to support social economic inclusion. In Kenya, we also have the right not to be refused entry, and this really talks about the non-refoulement. I won't go much into detail, but this is again one of those safeguards that are anchored not only within the national laws but also at the global level. Another question that remains fundamental, but is still a major hindrance, is on freedom of movement. And really, if we're going to talk about durable solutions, the right to work and freedom of movement are the building blocks. They are the key enablers for access to durable solutions for most refugees. And it will always go back to the question of the lack of freedom of movement as hindering people from accessing services, but also from engaging meaningfully within the social economic development of the areas in which they are hosted. This remains a question to be seen in terms of freedom of movement for refugees in Kenya. We know that now the Act is not talking about encampment, but talking about designated areas. And it is that the Commissioner of Refugee Affairs in Kenya can gazette a whole of county as an area of designation for refugees, and in that case then allow a level of freedom of movement for refugees. However, this is something that is yet to be seen, even as more regulations are developed to implement the Act. Another critical factor that I want to highlight in this session is access to East Africa citizenship. The Act speaks about the right for East African citizens to actually opt out of refugee status and adopt the East African citizenship. This is a critical area that could really be a major milestone for most refugees that have access to the East African citizenship and would want to opt out. The criteria for this needs to be developed. Who is eligible, who is not? How do you actually access this is being developed within the regulations. But we see that this is something that would be how do I say not a major milestone, but a real learning for other East African countries. Because if we can have this, then it means that we would address the displacement situation significantly for those that would want to opt out of the refugee situation and adopt this. Of course, there's going to be major implications for refugees, because they would be opting out of the refugee status, meaning that assistance that comes to refugees, they would not be eligible for that. Then it would mean that they are able to fend for themselves as other East African citizens within the territory of the country. This is something that is yet to be determined and remains quite an unknown. But I think more advocacy around allowing this East African citizenship to actually be actualized will be very critical. Finally, we are looking at moving away from encampment and talking about settlement-based approaches. You might have heard that Kenya is now talking about a Shirika plan. And the Shirika plan is really a vision from the government of Kenya that talks about settlement-based approaches, increased inclusion of refugees and host communities within the areas in which they are hosted. A Shirika plan is still in development. It is not a policy, but a plan and a vision of the government of Kenya. There is quite a number of coordination mechanisms that need to be put in place, both at the national and at the county level. And there's a number of engagements with donor governments and with development actors that need to go into it in terms of really setting it rolling. At this time, we know that the government of Kenya has intimated that this will be one of the pledges that it makes for the upcoming Global Refugee Forum. We again, this is something that can be learned across different countries within this region in terms of really the move away from encampment into settlement-based approaches. So I'd like to stop there and open it up, maybe return to you, Irene, for any questions that might be in the chat, but also to have an honest discussion with all of you that are in the call this afternoon, in terms of also what you're seeing in your countries in terms of learning on implementation of laws, whether the laws themselves are the challenge or whether it's the implementation of it and so forth. So thank you so much, and back to you, Irene.
Thank you, Patience, for that elaborate submission. We do have one question from Yilma. I was trying to wrap my head around it, but he asks, is there any thought or initiation from the current government that has not been in the time of Uhuru administration for refugees in Kenya? I wonder in which particular context. Perhaps, Yilma, you can come in and clarify on this particular question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's correct, the points that you raised. You know, recently we are hearing from your current Prime Minister, good initiation in bringing the people of Africa together, and you know the states how to coordinate, and you know in such kind of with regard to development and other aspects. So you know you can see that there might be some sort of you know change in the area of refugees, you know, policy and legal framework and practices in Kenya. So my question is there any new happenings currently in Kenya, you know, because of this current government? You know, we are seeing here and there some thoughts in changes in Kenya from the Prime Minister. That's what I would like to know. Thank you.
Should I come in, Irene?
Please do, then we take the other one.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. And indeed, as you're saying, there's a significant shift in Kenya. And just recently within the ExCom, the Prime Minister was there, or how do I call him? The Chief Minister was there. And basically one of the things that he was highlighting is Kenya's commitment towards greater inclusion of refugees within the hosting areas. This is captured and well elaborated within this vision that the government is calling the Shirika Plan. So this is that plan to move away from encampment into settlement-based approaches. And even beyond that, because the Shirika Plan is not a policy or a law in and of itself, the anchor for this is the Refugee Act of 2021. And we are moving away from the 2006 Act into now the 2021 Act. Part of the reason why the 2026 Act was not serving refugees in Kenya anymore was because now, following the inauguration of the new constitution, there was devolution, and devolution really talked about counties having, you know, the government being devolved at the county level and counties having greater say with regards also to the populations within their areas. This means that the counties in Kenya now have greater say with regards to refugee management, even though refugee management is really still a national government function. The county authorities have to be consulted and have to be at the center of decision-making that affects the populations within their countries. So there is indeed quite a significant shift and movement in terms of the policy, but in terms of the legal environment. This will definitely mean that the coordination architecture needs to change at the national and the county level, with greater coordination between the national and the county, but also greater coordination within different ministries at the national level. These are being worked out within regulations that are currently being implemented, being passed to implement the Refugee Act of 2021. I hope that answers this, but also happy to clarify further or even to have a bilateral with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patience. There's another question from Nelson regarding the securitized approach and responsibility sharing. He says, since security agencies are the ones who interact with refugees most of the times as they come into the countries, they would like to seek refugee. Are they aware? They would like to seek refuge. Apologies. Are they aware of all these laws? That's one. Two, if not, as humanitarian agencies, what are we doing to continuously educate them on these UN protocols and agreements by various governments across the region?
Thank you so much for that question. And indeed, as you're saying, and as I presented shortly, the securitization narrative has really not gone away. There is a sense of normalcy that has returned because we know, for instance, in the context such as Kenya a few years ago, there was the declaration of closure of refugee camps and return of refugees. The reason why I'm saying the securitization narrative hasn't really gone away is because each time there is a major security incident in the region, then you will always hear the undertones of refugees being blamed for the insecurity situation. And I know that this has often been an unfair statement because there hasn't been evidence to the effect, particularly even in a country such as Kenya. But we know that the governments have been how do I say it in a politically correct way? The governments have been slow in terms of implementing laws and policies that allow for citizenship, and part of the reason is because they have they would like to ensure that refugees are managed within a specific area that one enables them to access services more easily, some of the reasons that are coming up, but also because we know that the undertone is securitization. This may not come up very openly, but we know that this undertone remains. And I think we need to continue to advocate for more awareness between security actors, humanitarian practitioners, development practitioners, and governments in terms of what does refugee hosting actually mean, what does it entail, and how do we protect refugees without having a securitized narrative that is unfair towards refugees. Of course, quite a number of trainings are ongoing within the region. We know that there are human rights organizations that are training various arms, not only of the government, but also various humanitarian actors and policy actors in terms of refugee management and refugee issues. So I think, like you rightly say, there's a question there of awareness, and there's a question there of increased advocacy, and particularly around human rights for refugees. Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
hope
Thank
that
you.
answers.
Thank you, Patience. And also maybe just to weigh in with regards to the securitization approach, you might be aware that there is a petition in court. The first petition was filed in 2012 regarding the same, also tied to the encampment approach, which was overruled by the High Court. Again, in 2017, that was the case. And we do have a petition currently after the 2021 declaration by the former deputy president regarding closure of the camps, which is yet to be ruled. And so, like Patience said, there is the government is also trying to be very careful with regards to just dishing out this securitized approach, since the same has been overturned twice in the court. So they're playing their cards very well, if I could put it that way. But it is still there in action. Mawian Ring asks regarding access to East Africa citizenship, could you kindly elaborate more on how it works or will work especially for refugees?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The East Africa citizenship option is available and is anchored on the law. But in terms of how this is going to be implemented, who is going to be eligible, what criteria is going to be used, how to opt out of the refugee status and actually take this up, and the implications for it are really yet to be seen. What we know is that this option will be available to quite a number of refugees from the Great Lakes, the Burundian refugees, any Ugandan refugees that are there. Now, recently, Somalia is getting into the East Africa community, and it is yet to be seen whether Somali refugees will be eligible to apply for the East African citizenship. But in essence, as Somalia gets into East Africa, then it ideally should be that Somali refugees are eligible for it. So at this point, I think we would really be preempting much to say how that is going to look like, because the regulations are currently being developed for this.
Thank you, Patience. I would like to call in Ivan Sowino. He had raised his hand. So Evans, if you can hear us, kindly shoot your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. My question perhaps goes to Freddie, because recently the UN Action Agenda on Internal Displacements has come up with a more encompassing definition of, or rather understanding of durable solutions. That also includes the prevention of displacement. This obviously brings a new dimension to durable solutions and even makes it more complex. So it would be interesting to hear from Reds about your view on this and how we as practitioners can engage with this new framework, because we are already grappling to understand and actually operate within the existing framework. And yet now we have the United Nations Action Agenda on Internal Displacement, also including actions that contribute to the prevention of displacement. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Evans. Since this was directed to Freddie, Freddie, if you're there, would you kindly intervene, and then we can ask Patience to wrap this up.
Yes, thank you very much. I think if I got the question correctly, Evans, it related to how the new work around the action agenda fits in. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Freddie.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we are yet to see how this develops. I mean, in terms of how the policy agenda has proceeded, this flows really from the high-level panel report on internal displacement, which was done a few years ago. And in response to that high-level panel report, the UN pulled together its action agenda. And this is one of the challenges, I think, that we've been seeing, is that the sort of the normative framework around internal displacement is very different from that around refugees. And so it's slightly less kind of clear about where mandates lie and where responsibilities lie. But I think from the UN's perspective, this is very much around trying to kind of make sure that the UN has its own house in order, that it's as clear as possible on the different responsibilities and roles of different UN actors. And I think what's the kind of area around that action agenda, that there's a lot of different components to it. I can't remember off the top of my head how many actions there are. It's not trying, I think, to challenge the kind of existing policy frameworks in terms of the IASC frameworks. It's very much about trying to flesh them out. And actually, the topic of the next session around data is a big focus for the action agenda, is on thinking about, do we have the right data? What data are we gathering? Who's gathering it? Is it being done in a consistent way to the right level of quality and in a way that informs action? So it's not necessarily about kind of challenging the existing policy framework. It's more about trying to make sure that actually it's being implemented properly. But I think one of the challenges, it has been quite internal to the UN, because the UN recognizes that it has its own issues internally. And it can't necessarily sort of assert its authority over the kind of internal displacement space in quite the same way that UNHCR can over the refugee space, given its mandate around the kind of international legal framework. I think the other area where there's been a big push is around the kind of what we've seen from Robert Piper's team. And they've had quite a big role over the last 12 months in our region, in Somalia, They've been, Robert Piper has visited a couple of times now, also in Ethiopia. He's also been to South Sudan. And I think the push from there is very much about saying, one of the challenges, one of the reasons we struggle to promote solutions is because actually it's still too often in the humanitarian space. And we need to kind of really make this big pivot into developmental approaches, into government-led approaches to unlock the kind of resources that are required to support the kind of actions that are required for long-term durable solutions. So I think that's really kind of the push that team has been making from the center, and seeing itself over a relatively short space of time, trying to kind of make that, really make that kind of big shift within the way the aid system is working. I think we have been trying to work quite closely with that team, support them to think about what that means in the particular context in the region. I think one of the challenges, it goes back to some of the things we spoke about earlier, is that, well, we can all agree on the kind of aspiration. The realities of taking that kind of developmental-led, government-led approach in a country like Somalia and a country like South Sudan is challenging. And so it goes back to these ideas of really making sure that we're putting this into context, we're thinking about local politics, and we're not losing the kind of engagement with reality as we also think about these kind of bigger picture efforts. But yeah, that's maybe just a kind of few thoughts, but very happy to follow up on that in due course as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Freddie. Over to you, Patience.
Thank you so much, Irene, and for all the questions that have come in. I appreciate the questions and the key takeaways that you have shared from this. So with that, I'd like just to wrap up that session and hand back over to you, Irene. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patience. At this juncture, I'll just hand it over to Andrew to take us through the measuring progress and data collections.
Okay, thank you very much, Irene. Please confirm that you can hear me well.
Loud and clear.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues. My name is Andrew Maina, Solutions Coordinator with RED Somalia. And in the next few minutes, maybe 15 or so, I'll be able to discuss with you elements around measuring progress on solutions, as well as highlight a tool that has been quite successful in Somalia in measuring solutions generally. Now, the structure of the conversation is around why we need to measure it, what essentially are we measuring, and then some new or emerging discussions around data for solutions, which Freddie had already made some mention to. So if we could go to the next slide. Here, the essence around the importance of data and measuring is one, as you may have seen by now or observed by now, durable solutions is a very gradual and complex long-term process. Involves gradually diminishing displacement-related vulnerabilities and ensuring that displacement-affected communities, IDPs among them, enjoy rights without discrimination based on their displacement. So that is the essentially the definition of durable solutions from the IDP IASC framework. Now, as a long-term process, it therefore means attaining sustainable reintegration requires multi-year planning that is linked to resource mobilization and allocation, given the fact that you are looking at very different or a composite set of rights around civil and political rights, around economic, social, and social rights. And I'll get to that in a few. And obviously, because there's limited resources, and as we started this conversation, you saw the sort of need across the region with the numbers of IDPs and refugees. And therefore, there is a requirement, or rather, this imbalance between resources and needs demands that there is need for reliable and sufficient data that supports the planning, implementation, and monitoring of solutions. And of course, that was linked to prioritization, because then given the number of, the need out there. There's need to prioritize what, what can be, affected first, or what is the most urgent and primary element or displacement vulnerability to address. And here, the most important thing to note is that, production of data in and of itself is not the solution. I think what is also of equal importance is the using the data to learn and to inform better durable solutions policies and programming. And I'll come back to this point when we look at the tool. Now, when it comes to the framework itself, the mention of protection, that IDPs no longer have protection and assistance needs and can access their rights without discrimination. So what are these needs, or what are these rights? What constitutes displacement related vulnerability? Now, the IASC framework provides some criteria which can be linked to larger criteria, such as the physical safety, material safety, and legal safety. And within that, there is the 8 IASC sub-criteria. And the first one is around safety and security, long-term safety and security, protection and social cohesion. And this, of course, is linked to SDG number 10 and number 16. There's also material safety, essentially looking at access to basic services. And here is essentially providing adequate standards of living, looking at housing, looking at health, looking at education, as well as food, water, and sanitation, all included in those basic services. Of course, there is a criteria on job creation and economic opportunities. So here is about employment and livelihoods, and particularly supporting displaced communities to become self-reliant. And in this is, and of course, this is a lot of this thinking is borrowed from the refugee field. Asking the question, one, can IDPs be able to meet their basic needs? Can they be able to meet housing, food, education, health? Do they have the necessary resources to be able to meet these needs? Be it employment, financial resources for those ones involved in business? Are they able to acquire debt? Can they get people to lend to them? And this has a lot, this is a clear indication, particularly in Somalia, on social capital. And can they be able to, acquire assistance? And then lastly, what is the sustainability of these resources that they use to meet their basic needs? And here, elements around social capital, around health status, around savings, are very critical. And therefore, it is not merely that IDPs are able to get these jobs, but whether these jobs actually allowing or these economic opportunities allow them to meet the basic needs as any other person out there. Another important sub-criteria within the material safety criteria is the restoration of housing, land, and property, and especially the mechanism through which to get that. Sorry, and here it's quite important to note that the provision, the access of that land is important, but also the wider policy and legal framework is also very important. If somebody has a land certificate or a title deed, that in and of itself may not prevent eviction. And we know we need a system where access to justice is also very strong, such that it will be able to prevent forced evictions or arbitrary evictions that would lead to displacement in the long term. Then in terms of material safety, this includes access to documentation, given that be recognized as a person under the law. Family reunification, and here it might differ from one place to another, given that some countries like Somalia, family splitting is done as a resilience strategy to ensure that they have different families in different locations where they can be able to access resources to meet their basic needs. Public participation is key. I think Mohammed placed a lot of emphasis on this point. How do we include communities in the decision-making processes? And whereas the framework, focuses a lot on the elections or participation in elections. There's a view that this is much broader than that, and that includes other decision-making processes, including development of plans at the local and sub-local levels. And then lastly, access to effective remedies. And these are all points that I have mentioned. And here, it's basically, once you look at this one, it will tell you to what extent IDPs are able to overcome those protection and assistance needs. And if you compare it to the wider population, the non-displaced population, it will be able to tell you to what degree IDPs, face or meet these criteria without discrimination. And I think that is the point on the next slide. Yeah, so here, I will introduce a tool that is used in Somalia that is called the Local Reintegration Assessment, that is the LORA. And also maybe just discuss a bit about how that we can use this, or how it can be used to prioritize based on the rights, needs, and legitimate interests of IDPs. Now, the LORA measures two things. One, it operationalizes the IASC framework by measuring the extent to which IDPs have access to the 8 sub-criteria, which essentially measures the level of protection and assistance needs. So the less access they have to these 8 sub-criteria, the ones that I've discussed in the previous slide, the more likely they are to face a protection and assistance need. And it also measures the level of variance of access between IDPs and non-IDPs to these 8 criteria. So the durable solutions concept, has this additional layer of access to rights without discrimination. And how this is measured practically on the ground is that it compares access to these 8 criteria of IDPs, then comparing it to a population of non-IDPs to sort of see where there are huge variances, which then is taken to or is construed to mean that there is likely to be some level of discrimination or disparity. Additionally, this tool adds a secondary element, which is the subjective measure. And here it asks IDPs whether of the 8 criteria, which of them would make them feel more integrated in a particular location. And here it is quite important, given, as I mentioned before, the resources that are needed to promote durable solutions, which is a long-term process, versus the resources that are available. Then you need to resources available versus the need. You need to be a bit practical about how this is implemented. So essentially, that's what that measures, a clear way to evaluate this information would come in the next slide. Yes, thank you. So this is a simple, simple way of trying to present the sort of data that will come out of that of such a tool. On the left hand side, you would see the inequality score. So essentially comparing access to the 8 criteria between the host and the IDP. And then at the top, it would it measures or tracks IDP perceived integration. So what are those critical elements that IDPs once they attain, they would feel more integrated. And then that creates this sort of quadrant where you have where an indicator lands on the high scale in perceived integration, but also on the high scale in inequality score. Then essentially, projects or programs or any intervention, would essentially be justified to say, okay, let's focus on this with the available resources that we have, given the fact that this is what IDPs determine is important to them as far as integration is concerned, and also given the fact that there is a wide disparity in terms of access to this between them and the non-displaced population. The other element to look at, again, is where you have integration that, elements that are high in integration for IDPs, and then but are not necessarily do not necessarily have high inequality. So essentially, when you're focusing on this people-centered approach, looking at what are some of these things that where IDPs would essentially get, then it would mean that they feel more integrated and therefore essentially meeting their legitimate interests and needs. And again, some of the things that have been mentioned in the past include trust in institutions, access to water, and what have you. Then the second last quadrant is around what is not very highly perceived among IDPs to be relevant to their integration, but we see a lot of inequalities, which also spell that there is a specific need, protection and assistance need that needs to be addressed. And then, of course, those ones that score low in the quadrant, then these ones can essentially be deprioritized. So this is basically an example of how such a tool can be used in a high need, low resource context. And in a way that respects both the rights, needs, and legitimate interests of IDPs. So on the last point, before I welcome any points of clarification or questions, is essentially on the point on insights and prioritization. I think I've mentioned that. The one I want to focus on here is the emergent conversations on data in Somalia. And this is also linked to the UN Action Agenda. And I think as framed by Freddie, the Action Agenda does not introduce anything new. In fact, it restates elements that are well documented in the guiding principles on internal displacement. It also re-emphasizes the same that are included, which have you, the guiding principle also focuses on the three elements: prevention, protection, as well as solutions. The Kampala Convention, which largely borrows from the guiding principles, also focuses on these three themes, which then the UN Action Agenda re-emphasizes in the document. And I think they're about 31 commitments that the UN is making towards the government, towards IDPs and other actors involved in the solution space. And one of the things that is mentioned in that is maybe more sophisticated or a better way to prioritize displacement specific needs into three general categories. So if you look at the IASC framework, it essentially states that there are four core there are four core criteria. The one around long-term safety, the one around access to services, the other one around HLP mechanisms, and the one on economic employment and livelihoods. And it says that in all contexts, then these four would essentially apply. But it goes on to say that the additional four may not apply to all contexts, and therefore, might apply as and when, different contexts. So in one context, the documentation might be an important thing, and in another, it may not. So, for instance, in Somalia, family reunification may not be as high in the order of priorities, given the fact that family splitting is a strategy that families use to support themselves and become more resilient. But if you compare that with, say, security, land tenure security, then land tenure security is higher. Or if you compare it with employment and livelihood. So here, essentially, there's a conversation of creating three buckets or three categories. One is IDPs that have severe displacement vulnerabilities, which would essentially be measured by, if these IDPs have less than, have access to less than 3 out of the 8, then, each country would decide which 3 to use, which 3 are relevant, which 3 criteria are relevant for them. The second category would be IDPs that are on a solutions pathway that would have attained at least 4 of the 8. Again, each country will decide which of the 4 is most important, to meet this criteria. And then lastly, those ones who have achieved 8 of the 8. And essentially here is to sort of prioritize and see which IDP populations more, require more of humanitarian support versus those ones who require more of a development, more resilient support, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's also a conversation that includes moving towards system-level indicators, particularly trust in government institutions, level of interactions between government and citizens. And I think the point that Freddie raised at the very beginning is that there needs to be a reconnection between the government as well as the displaced affected community, so that that social contract can be reestablished. And based on that, I think those are the few points I wanted to raise during this discussion. So perhaps I can respond to any questions or comments that you raise. Thank you very much. Irene?
Thank you, Andrew. I haven't seen any question yet, but I will circle back to the question raised earlier by Mohammed Noor Aden. I have just reposted it again. He seeks to find out about our strategic, tactful, and our experiential engagement with the donors and other humanitarian actors. The first question he asks is, does RED's engagement with the development actors to obtain durable solutions for IDPs in Somalia? Did you get that clearly?
Yes, yes.
Yes. The second one is, does REDS engage the government of Kenya, the government of Somalia, sorry, in advocacy on land and IDPs, which you have slightly touched on?
Okay.
Yeah, so those two.
Okay, yeah, in the interest of time, let me respond quickly before I give the next speaker. The answer to those questions is yes. Yes, REDS with only development actors, but also humanitarian resilience, peace building, as well as government actors themselves, including IDPs on the ground. Although,
excuse me, Andrew.
Our engagement with
Allow me to interject. Your internet was quite scrambled when you are responding, so if you can take that again.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, is it clear now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, yeah. So the response to the question is yes on both accounts. Yes, we do engage with government, with development actors such as the World Bank, donors that have a development outlook, such as the development unit in FCDO, as well as the EU. And essentially, they are quite engaged in the durable solution space. But beyond that, we also engage with other actors, as mentioned, including humanitarian actors, peace building, as well as stabilization and resilience actors. And I think the point that we try to emphasize as we engage all these actors is that no one no one person or no one agency can be able to attain solutions, and the fact that the solutions must be multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder, given the variety of rights that IDPs need to achieve and the variety of protection and assistance needs that IDPs need to overcome. In terms of government engagement and particularly advocacy around land, the answer is yes, but not specifically on land, but in a wide spectrum that involves all the relevant rights to on solutions. So what we do is support the government in the implementation of the National Durable Solutions Strategy, which includes a key component, I think, under outcome 1 of that strategy. It includes a key component around land and around access to land. But I think the most important thing that we need to be very clear on is that solutions for different IDPs will look differently. Solutions will look different to different IDPs, and therefore there are those IDPs that really value access to land. And particularly those ones that their livelihood is tied to land, but there are those ones who would prefer getting assistance or support that will allow them to seek opportunities elsewhere. So there are IDPs that really value education, and they would want to attain that education that will give them a set of skills that they can be able to apply either somewhere else in Somalia or across the border. So our work essentially is promoting or advocating that all actors, including the government, actually listen consistently and in a manner that is promotes autonomy, promotes fair representation, promotes fair procedural action, and in a way that IDPs feel that they can be able to influence the outcome, and therefore it's more people-centered and likely to be sustainable in the long term. Yeah, so thank you very much, and maybe over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Andrew. Is it any other question or response in the chat section? And I think at this juncture, in the interest of time, we will go straight into the stakeholder coordination and invite Meretab, our manager from Ethiopia, to take over. Welcome, Meretab.
Thank you very much, Irene. Can I have confirmation that you can hear me?
Loud and clear, and we can see you too.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Maratab. I'm the country representative for REDS in Ethiopia, based in Addis.
In Masalit Munzeka. I just took it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe I will start from what Andrew has mentioned at the end point. No one actor or agency can bring solutions to displacement affected communities. And that's why we need to talk about multi-stakeholder approach in our responses. And that's why we need to coordinate in an increasingly more effective way to bring solutions to displacement affected communities. And when we say displacement affected communities, we're talking about refugees, IDPs, host communities, definitely returnees, all these sort of names that we give to different categories of people. So in terms of understanding why we talk about stakeholder coordination, then there are different cause dynamics and settings that will force us to coordinate better. For example, we talk about causes, conflict-induced and disaster-induced, and these responses must coordinate better between themselves, urban and camp-based refugees and IDPs, for example, and also about the different categories of people that we talk about. So the point is that whatever responses that we try to bring on specific group of people will definitely affect the other group of people. If we're having policies and implementation discussions on urban refugee programming, for example, that would definitely affect how the encampment works or not works in a particular setting. So across sectors, across settings, and across dynamics, actors that has been engaged in different levels must be speaking to each other. And this coordination must work at international level, at regional level, national level, and of course, subnational levels. The other linkage that we need to do, and you can specifically refer to the action agenda, and this has been mentioned before, is linkage across the responses. Like we have prevention responses, and when people are displaced or when people are affected by displacement, we talk about assistance and protection, and we have this talk of durable solutions. And the action agenda specifically says that the overarching aim of this agenda is to do in all these three sectors, like prevention, assistance and protection, and durable solutions. We also need to have coordination between humanitarian development and peace building aspects. And speaking as a humanitarian, for example, we have the principle of do no harm principle. Whatever we do on the humanitarian aspect should not affect negatively the peace building efforts that other actors are doing. And definitely, so a certain actor working on the humanitarian response side must be speaking with actors who are doing something on the peace building side. And this coordination can have different frameworks, and it depends on the specific laws and policies that a certain country or at international level are enacted. So one other point which is necessary in terms of understanding why we talk about coordination is the whole of society approach. And with the primary responsibility of government approach, particularly on the internal displacement side, we also talk about the whole of government approach. So you can have specific agencies, that's the focal point for responses in a certain government. But definitely the principle is that the whole of the government machinery must work towards bringing solutions to displacement affected communities. And we also talk about coordination because the international binding and non-binding laws and policies also talk about coordination. Some of the examples are mentioned in the left side of the slide, for example. When you specifically talk about the action agenda on it, the solutions to internal displacement, we talk about whole of society approach, whole of government approach. We talk about primary responsibility of the state to respond to internal displacement. We also talk about whole of displacement approach. Whenever we try to approach response to internal displacement, we cannot ignore the issues which are related to returnees and refugees as well. So there are specific policies and laws that talk about how the coordination must work, and that multi-stakeholder approach must be the way forward. In terms of actors, and maybe specifically talking about Ethiopia, and this may also be true for other for others as well, we have different actors working on the response to displacement affected communities. We have definitely the government, which has the primary responsibility in all this. And when you talk about the government, we talk about the government at different levels. Discussing about Ethiopia, we talk about the national government, or what we call the federal government. It has a refugee agency, refugee and return service. It has also an IDP agency, as we can say, maybe Ethiopian Disaster Risk Management Commission. And there is also the Ministry of Peace, which is given such responsibility by the Kampala Convention Ratification Proclamation. All these actors try to respond to to displacement issues, and how much coordinated they are depends on the time and circumstances, of course. So currently, as we see, for example, EDRMC and Ministry of Peace, then which specific organ is relevant for durable solutions for internal displacement is not clear in Ethiopia, and there must be clarity in terms of this. And one of the way forward in terms of that clarity has been that the Ministry of Peace has been mandated to concern itself with internal displacement based on the ratification proclamation, as I said. We have UN agencies, and among them specific agencies responsible for specific tasks. UNHCR has always been the responsible organ in terms of refugee responses. It has been working with refugee and return service of the government in bringing solutions to refugees in Ethiopia. We have IOM, which has been the major organ in terms of internal displacement in Ethiopia, for example, particularly on the durable solution side. But because of the action agenda and the special advisors, the UN special advisors mission to Ethiopia, UNDP is also coming to be one of the leading organizations in terms of responses to internal displacement. And of course, on all discussions on durable solutions, because there must be one UN, UN organizations must work as one, then we have the resident coordinator office, which is supposed to coordinate actions within the UN. So we have the NGOs, which can be national and international. We have the human rights organizations, which are very critical, which have been recently coming to the fore in terms of bringing or monitoring and investigation of issues related to IDPs and refugees particularly. And we also have, because knowledge and evidence is very critical, we also have what we call research partners, and of course those donors who provide the finance to this kind of responses. One point here, as you can see from the map, is that not a specific organization is limited to one. So there are coincidences, definitely, organizations that work in or that can be categorized in as implementers, policymakers, or research partners. Okay, going ahead with the next slide. Then what does a coordination look like in Ethiopia? So The refugee response and response to internal displacement has unfortunately been very categorized in Ethiopia. There are specific actors wholly responsible for one group of people and not for the others. This can be improved, definitely. The refugee response and response for internal displacement must be coordinated much better. But this has been the way Ethiopia or actors in Ethiopia has been organizing responses in Ethiopia. So on the refugee response, for example, we have the mandated organizations, the Refugee and Return Service from the government and UNHCR from the UN system, all other implementing organizations working to support the initiatives at national and international levels. The idea from the CRRF has been to establish steering committees and technical committees at national level to guide the responses for refugees in Ethiopia. Unfortunately, this hasn't been functional for a long time. In terms of the internal displacement, we were supposed to have, because of the Durable Solution Initiative, we were supposed to have the National Durable Solution Working Group. We have it in principle, but because its function has been through meetings, the meetings has not happened often. But the idea was there would be national durable solution working groups and durable solution working groups to be established at regional and local levels as well. As I said, Ministry of Peace is mandated to coordinate internal displacement matters in Ethiopia. And at some point, we also had what we call the Durable Solution Technical Advisory Group to support whatever the Durable Solution Working Group would do. Also in 2021 and continuing with 2022, we also had the Interministerial Task Force, which was specifically established to respond to displacement issues in northern Ethiopia, but later expanded to national forum as well. The Interministerial Task Force, one of its achievements is, as you can see, it has been a multi-stakeholder agency with government, UN agencies, and some UN or some NGOs participating, and it's one of the achievements that it has done is drafting the IDP proclamation, which we hopefully expect to have is that binding in the near future. One message that may be given in terms of coordination can be about the level of coordination that can work. And as I said, the National Coordination Forum, particularly on the IDP response, has not been working very well in terms of durable solutions. But this doesn't mean that it will not be working at subnational levels. For example, in Ethiopia, in terms of laying the foundation, in terms of establishing mechanisms to proceed with durable solution programs in a specific area, Somali region has been one of the best examples we always had. It had established structures for refugee responses and for responses to internal displacement for long, and the meetings that we expect would happen through these forums has been happening for quite some time. And definitely some of the durable solution working groups established at zonal levels and at regional levels has also been working, but yeah, Somali region can be cited as the best example. And the message we take from this is that we don't need to depend at the national level for programs and others to happen. We can try it at a very local level, and forums and multi-stakeholder forums can be established at local levels as well. So for the Somali region, as you can see, in terms of refugee response, we have the CRRF coordination mechanisms at regional level and at district levels and below. For the internal displacement as well, we have the Somali region Durable Solution Working Group with its, of course, technical advisory group. Maybe we can proceed to the next one. Yes. So in all these multi-stakeholders coordination discussion, one of the topics we must discuss, and one of the topics whose importance have been increasing is what we call the participation of displacement affected communities in these coordination levels. Why? Because yeah, the principle that nothing about us without us is a very important principle, and displacement affected communities must be at the center. It's not only because of principle actually, but it's because it's also very, very essential for improving programming and policies for durable solution activities in any country. As has been discussed by Mohammed and Freddie before, lots have been done about understanding the aspiration of displacement affected communities, but less has been done about understanding their capacity. So one of the improvements is any program or any organization implementing a program on displacement should do is in terms of understanding the capacities of displacement affected communities, because that would be a huge help for sure in terms of advancing programs. And with the limited resources that we have now, then definitely organizations must work closely with displacement affected communities in terms of understanding the capacities and building on that capacities of the communities. And we have some examples on this, and some of the examples will definitely be presented in our upcoming durable solution mainstreaming trainings that we will be conducting in January. What are we talking about? We're talking about meaningful participation, and what that means has been covered in different studies. We are also talking about accountability to displacement affected communities, and how that is to be achieved depends on the countries. In Ethiopia, for example, when you talk about refugee responses, we don't have so much refugee-led organizations, so to speak. What we have is what we call the RCCs, Refugee Central Committees, who are selected by refugees and who represent specific camps or urban settings in that case. In terms of IDP representative, I think we can say the same. We haven't advanced a lot in terms of meaningful participation of IDPs in policies and programs. I'm sorry to go beyond the time, but I think I have to stop here and give the chance for questions and reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meritab, for that comprehensive and the way you have unpacked your presentation in a very simplistic manner. So thank you for that. I do not see any question or reaction, the chat box yet, but allow me to perhaps raise one more question based on the last statement you made before we move on to the next step and wrap up. You have said that less is being done with regards to strengthening capacities of displaced affected communities. From where you sit, where do you think the localization agenda for Ethiopia is at? Where would you rate it? And two, what can be done in your view to strengthen the capacities, technical, financial, or otherwise, in order to advance programs?
Yeah. Thank you, Irene. So, yeah, very, very important question that you asked. So in Ethiopia, we have the localization working group. And one of the things that group is trying to do is to support national NGOs to be included in the financing mechanisms, for example. There are donors who have now specific requirements for the inclusion of national NGOs in any of the proposals as you submit and everything. So there are different efforts happening in Ethiopia at policy level in terms of inclusion of national NGOs. How local are these national NGOs? That's a question that we need to continue discussing, but yeah, that's a lot of improvement in that sense. At program level, one of the things I wish to mention was that, for example, there are different organizations that implement what we call community-based planning, where they assign some specific money for projects, but these projects and their designs would be, these projects and their contents would be designed by the communities themselves. So communities come together. It can be in an area-based approach where refugee representatives and IDP representatives come together, write a proposal, submit it to the organization, and then the organization will select some proposals and give them funding. And this is a very good example, because this refugee and host communities are included in this proposal development and in identifying what specific needs they want to be solved. So this can be taken as one of the lessons that we can learn. It's not defined as policy level, unfortunately, but it's one of the good examples that we can take. Another one I wanted to mention, and this in terms of coordination, was like, even though the high level policy level discussion or coordination mechanisms are not working, we can continue with coordination in our programs and projects, even at project level. And we have seen very successful projects and programs which were completed by consortiums. So consortium-based programming and projects would definitely support the multi-stakeholder coordination mechanisms that we also talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Meritab. That is satisfactory. At this juncture, allow me to call in Freddie to wrap this up for us. We are envisaged to finish at 4:30, and so we are right on track. Over to you, Freddie.
Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you, Meritab, Andrew, and Patience, for all your inputs this afternoon. I'm really conscious that we're more or less at the end. I'm sure people have places to go. Thanks so much for your patience and being with us. We just had a couple of things we wanted to finish with. We also wanted to share a evaluation form. Yeah, thanks, Francis. He's just put it into the chat box. So please, we would encourage you to start completing that now. And then so you can get it in before you finish. We know when people don't start it before the end of the meeting, then it's much less likely that you'll take the time. So please, if you have a moment, do. And really, while people hopefully are starting to do that, just a couple of points from me at the end, and I don't want to kind of labor it. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think from the questions that have been posed, I sense that people have found the session really stimulating. We would really appreciate your feedback. There's so much to potentially cover. What we try to cover in this session is really, we used to call it the what, as opposed to then the mainstreaming sessions, which we follow up with and we try to do on a country by country basis. I'll come to that in a moment, and where we really get into the kind of how. So some of the questions around what kind of programming, what kind of interventions, what kind of activities, what does that look like? But we feel that it's really important to set this solid base before we get into that about, well, what are we even talking about here? How do we start to engage with this highly complex process? And this diagram is one attempt that we've made to try and kind of capture all the different components around it, to try and kind of the points that have been made and a number of times this afternoon about starting on the left there from both the kind of critical importance of local context and also focusing on the rights and the needs and the interests of displacement affected communities. And if we start from those two things, then we think we're in a much stronger basis to think about durable solutions. And then this kind of complex interaction of different kinds of interventions that can come into play and that need to be thought about in terms of sequencing and layering. So here you can see all the different things that we've talked about in terms of addressing kind of immediate needs, responding to rights, and creating an enabling environment, that big black arrow at the top. But then underneath that, the different components of the nexus. So we have the humanitarian, the peace building, the development piece, all coming in there, as well as the kind of very strong importance of human rights and rights-based approaches if we're really going to support sustainable integration. So I think it's important to kind of recognize the complexity of solutions and the number of different dimensions to it. But also, I hope that we've also given you a way into thinking about the kind of the real basics and the core of it. And for me, I think it is about going back to thinking about where people are coming from and where they're going. And ultimately, I think solutions can only be, we know that the whole point of the displacement phenomenon everywhere and in this region is that people vote with their feet. If they're not able to survive or thrive in an environment, in a particular environment, and they can move, they will. So solutions will only be durable if people's aspirations and needs are met. It's a very simple point, but I think if we keep a focus on that, then it becomes a bit easier to start prioritizing and thinking about how to operate. Maybe moving to the next slide. So this is just a couple of slides on kind of our work and how we're approaching this. It's come up a number of times, and I think a couple of the questions are also probed onto this. This is sort of the kind of strategic framework we've been using for the last couple of years, with REDS's role really being kind of framed around the translation of evidence and knowledge into practice and working with partners to do that in this kind of multi-stakeholder way. At the heart of the diagram there, you have the kind of core work which we do, so research and analysis, capacity development, courses like this, developing tools, supporting innovation, working with policymakers and convening. That's a huge part of what we do, is a lot of bringing together different actors in different fora. The grey bubbles are really kind of the kind of core areas we've been trying to prioritize for the last couple of years. So you see there at the top the emphasis on people-centered approaches, which we've talked about quite a bit. The emphasis on coordination and coherence, which is something that REDS has done a lot on over the last 8 years since we were first. I wonder if someone could just put the mute on. Thanks. And then also looking at resources and thinking hard about the kind of combination of different kinds of resources that are required to support solutions. And then on the outside there, it's some of the kind of more analytical work that we do. And something we haven't talked about so much this afternoon, but we've been exploring a bit, is thinking about mobility and the role that mobility plays in enabling durable solutions. And I think there's quite a bit of research on that around at the moment, and quite interesting work as well. And also trying to support this cross-country, cross-regional learning as well. So yes, and then in terms of ways of engaging with us, there is, and please feel free to reach out. There are contacts for us in the slide pack. They're coming up in a second. As Francis has said, we'll also be sharing this. But yeah, there's lots of different ways you can engage, and please do reach out to us. Whether it's about work that we've done already, work that we've done in the past. We've just been going through a process of refreshing our website. One of the things we're going to be having on there going forwards is a kind of regular blog to kind of update on some of the kind of new work that we're doing, and make sure that there's a kind of up-to-dateness to that work. And we work both at the country level, at the regional level. We have kind of dedicated teams working on Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia. So if you're in those countries, then we should be quite present. Some of the other countries of the region, we operate on a more kind of regional basis, I would say, if that makes sense. We've been doing a little bit on Sudan and South Sudan recently, and may do more there in future. And we also have a body of work at from a regional perspective, working in the Great Lakes. So Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, DRC, and Tanzania. And we're looking to kind of synergize our work across those different areas over the next couple of years. So it's quite a broad base, but we engage in different ways in those different countries. But as I say, please reach out if you want to find out more. This slide shows a few of the things that we have coming up in the next couple of months. Events in Kenya, Somalia. There's a couple of things missing. We'll make sure actually that there's an updated version of this slide in the version that we'll send around, because I know there's a couple of things that were added to this. So there's an event coming up in Nairobi with IGAD at the end of this month, looking at development responses to displacement. There's also a learning event planned in Somalia next month, about which more details will be forthcoming shortly. And then on to the next slide. Here are some contacts for myself, patient Andrew and Meritab, who you've heard from this afternoon. Also the link to our website and a kind of new sign up to our newsletter. And I think that is the final slide, if I'm not wrong, Francis. So just to say thank you very much indeed. I'm really happy we've been able to kind of keep so many of you with us this afternoon. And again, your feedback and comments on how we can improve this session. We try to make it as kind of broad as possible, but while also getting into some specifics. to be able to kind of be relevant to a wide range of people. So it's good to see high participation, and do please also mention it to colleagues or people you think would be interested. We'll certainly be planning to run another one of these in the next 6 months or so. But thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to working with you all in future. And I think with that, I can close the session. All right. Thank you very much for the kind words and the thank yous. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we will speak to you all soon, I hope.